Welcome to this Java break with Basis. Today we're going to look at several good reasons to use the latest BBX. This is part one of a two-part series of Java breaks that we're going to be running in the upcoming weeks. Let's look at our agenda. We're going to consider some of our building blocks and discuss a couple of features that may have escaped your attention. In the database management system in particular, we're going to look at a new feature called Asynchronous Triggers and show you a demonstration of how it might be used in your business. We'll have a look at development tools. We're going to surface a utility that you may not be aware of that we have in our arsenal, the BBXImage Utility. And then we're going to touch on some Eclipse BDT plugin features that we think you're going to find useful in all of your development projects. Then we're going to consider the availability of these features and functions to be used with your particular interpreter, Pro5, Visual Pro 5, or BBJ. And then we'll take your questions. Let's get started. We recently made some changes to the language and interpreter and also enhanced our conversion utilities for OpenBasic and Thoroughbred. This was as a result of completing a couple of large conversion projects. You might find it useful as well if you have an opportunity to convert a client of yours from the older Business Basic to BBJ. In the language interpreter, we've also added an enhanced BBjHtmlView control. The enhanced functionality is courtesy of the new JavaFX browser. It requires a JavaFX supported version of Java on both the client and the server machines, which is currently shipping with Java 8. In the enhanced mode, it supports HTML5, CSS 2.1, and JavaScript. The best way to see the improved functionality is for us to demonstrate it to you. Let me hand you off to Nick Decker to demonstrate the improved functionality of the JavaFX BBjHtmlView versus the legacy BBjHtmlView.
For BBJ15, Basis dramatically improved the legacy BBjHtmlView control with the option to use the JavaFX embedded browser instead. The HTML view has always worked great in BUI, as it's really just another instance of the capable browser that you're running on your desktop or mobile device. But when your BBJ app runs in GUI outside of the browser, it uses the legacy Java HTML editor kit that's quite dated. For perspective, the legacy implementation only supports HTML version 3.2. To put that in terms that we can all understand, HTML 3.2 was supplanted by HTML4 in 1997. This GUI program demonstrates the differences in capabilities of the legacy and the new JavaFX-based HTMLView control. We'll start by viewing the BUI showcase page hosted on our local Jetty web server. With the legacy browser, the page is very difficult to read. None of the links at the top of the page are functional, and the image is so compressed you can't make any sense out of it. Switching to the new HTML view gives us what we've come to expect. The navigation bar links work correctly, and the page scrolls to the desired position using smooth animation. The background image is now visible, and even the BUI sample image displays correctly instead of being compressed, as it was with the legacy control. Next, we want to compare a remote web page, so we'll load up www.basis.com. The legacy view doesn't look right at all, and the top horizontal menu is shown incorrectly as a vertical list on the left side. When we switch to the JavaFX view, the page is displayed correctly, and the menu is now rendered as a dynamic horizontal navigation bar. Loading an interactive site, such as Google Maps, shows some of the limitations of the legacy control. The CSS sprite images used on the page are shown as a single large collection at the top of the page, and scrolling down reveals multiple copies of the navigation controls used for zooming in and out of the map. In contrast, the enhanced control displays the interactive content correctly. We can search for locations and even check traffic patterns for our route to the office. Our last test shows a Wikipedia entry for a popular multiplayer game called Dota 2. On the JavaFX control, the page looks just like any other Wikipedia page with a 3-column layout. The legacy control has difficulty rendering the page correctly, especially when it comes to some of the text that's supposed to be in the right-hand column. It's now shown on the left, and the point size is so small it's nearly impossible to read. The enhanced BBjHtmlView control far surpasses the legacy version, and you can start using it today by turning on a global string table entry.
Thanks, Nick. Well, we promised you some features and functions that would save you time and save you money. And this is probably one of the best. We have a new feature in the database management system called Asynchronous Triggers. What is it? It allows triggers to fire in a target file system as the result of a file operation on the source relating to any change to the database. You can choose to have the trigger code execute on the target machine rather than on the source machine, avoiding impacting normal operations. A good use case may be data transformation, wherein you may decide to do major manipulation to the data, and by offloading those modifications to the target machine, you avoid affecting your normal business operations. This is all built on very similar architecture to the replication and change auditing functionality built into BBJ's database. What better way to see asynchronous triggers in action than just to demonstrate it? In our case here, we're going to convert an mkeyed file into an ESQL file in near real time by leveraging the asynchronous trigger functionality.
Asynchronous triggers can be thought of as the combination of database replication and triggers, meaning that we can replicate data to remote machines, but without the stipulation that the remote copies have to be identical to the source. This means that we're allowed to transform the data so that the target can be a different file type and even a different number of columns and keys. Our example will explore this feature using the Chili Company database as installed on a Mac, meaning that it's the standard set of mkeyed files. Our asynchronous triggers will keep a remote copy of the database up to date in near real time with any changes made to the source files. The key, though, is that in addition to our data warehouse version existing on a remote machine, all of the data files will be ESQL files, and they'll have extra columns to help us keep track of modifications. The first step involves creating the remote or the data warehouse version of the Chili Company on the remote Windows machine. To avoid reinventing the wheel, we'll use the data warehouse creation utility that's installed with the BBJ demos. This program creates an ESQL version of a database, and we can add a few more lines of code to add new columns to every table, including a column that determines if the record is active, one that keeps track of when the record was modified, and another that records which user modified the record. Next, we set up the asynchronous trigger job in Enterprise Manager with our remote Windows machine configured as the target. We'll also specify the trigger programs on the remote machine that handle all of the data modifications. These programs will automatically be launched whenever we write to our source files or remove records. They'll be responsible for getting the modified record and making the appropriate changes for the target. Lastly, we'll include the list of data files to keep in sync, and we're given the opportunity to exclude files if desired. Trigger programs cannot interact with the user, so we'll add a couple of println statements to each one so that we can tail the BBJ logs and get an idea of when the triggers run. This excerpt shows that we get the trigger data object, then from that we get the key and the user that's removing the record. We then log this information out. Alright, it's time to see this in action. On our source machine, we're viewing the customer tables data, and it's the standard database without any extra columns. We'll switch to the remote Windows machine where we're viewing the data warehouse version of the Chili Company database. This is the version that we created with our utility program and is now kept in sync with the source database on the Mac. The customer table adds an extra ESQL ID identity field, and scrolling to the end displays our added active and modified fields. On the bottom of the screen, we're tailing the BBJ log file so we can get real-time feedback whenever the triggers fire to keep the data files in sync. Switching back to the Mac, we'll modify the customer's first name from Gregory to just plain Greg. Clicking the Save button displays the SQL that will execute to make the change. After committing the change, we switch over to the Windows machine. Notice that our log file shows a new entry saying that Endecker wrote to the customer table. After refreshing our view of the data, we see that the change from Gregory to Greg has already taken effect. Scrolling to the end of the columns, we now see that we have new entries showing that Endecker modified the record along with a timestamp. So writes are being propagated correctly. What about removes? Our goal for the additional active column is to have it track the state of a record. When someone removes a record from the source, we don't really want to remove it from the target. Rather than lose that information, we just want to flag it as inactive. To test this, we'll delete the second customer from the data file. Switching over to the Windows machine shows another trigger log entry, this time saying that Endecker removed customer number 2. After refreshing our data view, we notice that customer 2 is still there. So far, so good. Scrolling over to the last columns reveals that the record has been marked inactive, and we have a record of who last modified it and when. Our triggers work perfectly. We now have our augmented data warehouse version of the Chili Company that's kept in sync with a remote source via BBJ's asynchronous triggers.
Thanks very much, Nick. Let's have a look at an excerpt of the remove trigger code. At the top section, we get the information about the file and the database table that the user is attempting to access. We also have some output to a log just for our debugging purposes. And then below, we set some new values to the record. The active flag is set to 0, meaning that it's inactive. We set the modification time and the user that's modifying the record, and then we update the transaction. At the end of our session today, we'll make available to you the sample source code that we've used to create the asynchronous triggers, and you can look through it at your leisure. Next, let's look at the BBXImage Utility that I mentioned earlier. It allows you to edit images, apply filtering, modify borders, flip, save the image as a different format, PNG for example, and a whole host of other editing capabilities. You can also create batch processes to manipulate multiple images. It's simple, there's a short amount of code required, and since all of this is also runnable as a BUI app, it's easily shareable and saves you money by not buying expensive editing software. It's a real time saver for all users. Let me hand you back to Nick again to have a demonstration of the BBXImage Utility in action.
The BBXImage Utility provides several methods for basic image modification, with the option to save the result to the disk or export to a few different formats, such as a BBJ image. While many graphic editors, like Adobe Photoshop, offer some of the same capabilities, the BBXImage Utility can be a fantastic alternative for some common use cases. Let's take a look at a typical use case. We're going to get a screenshot of one of our applications, a dashboard, and spruce it up a bit so that it will be suitable for a presentation. Rough screenshots just don't cut it when we're preparing images for customer consumption, such as PowerPoints, documentation, magazine layouts, etc., and we want it to look as good as possible. After launching our dashboard app, we'll take a screenshot using Jing, an image capture and sharing utility. The problem is that Jing, like virtually all screen capture programs, saves out a rectangular portion of the screen. Since OS windows have rounded corners, we're often left with dark portions of our desktop visible at the edges of the screenshot. So when dealing with screenshots, a quality result usually means that we do want to cut corners. We can easily fix this interactively using a BUI demo application that provides a graphical front end for a few of the common BBXImage utility functions. The utility can retrieve a source image not only from the disk, but also from an image's URL that's published on the web. This works out great, as Jing shows us the image preview on the web, and we can easily copy and paste the URL for the screenshot into our utility program. Once the image is loaded, it's automatically scaled to fit in the preview area using the BBXImage Utility's scaling methods. We'll show it at 100% and then get to work improving it. For starters, we'll knock out the dark corners. It's a bit bland and bleeds into the background, so we'll add a border to it. Red really isn't our first choice, so we'll change the border to a single pixel of basic black. Lastly, we'll add a subtle drop shadow to give it a bit more depth, and then save out our modified copy. The BBXImage utility allows you to save an image in PNG or JPEG format, and when you choose a JPEG, you can even specify a compression factor, letting you influence the final image's size and quality. Since this is a buoy app, I could easily host it on my company's internal network so that all my coworkers could do basic image cleanup for their own images without requiring expensive editing software on everybody's machine. That worked great for a single image, but if I have dozens to process, I certainly don't want to go through that process over and over again. I can write a program so that in a dozen lines of code, I can make these same changes to all of my screenshot images in a local folder. The code is straightforward as it simply processes my image files in a loop. It starts by determining the source and target name, creates a BBXImage version of the screenshot, rounds the corners, sets the border and drop shadow, and then saves it out as a ping. It executes in less than a second, and the results are great. Each image looks much more professional with the desktop remnants removed from the corners and the border and drop shadow adding polish and depth. The magnified portion at the bottom of the screen shows how nice the corners look now compared to the original image. The BBXImage Utility isn't meant to replace Photoshop, but it's a real time saver. Not only can it do real-time graphic manipulation in any BBJ application, you can use it to batch process tons of images automatically without any human interaction.
Thanks, Nick. This last item, I think, will have great resonance with many of you. Our basis engineers have been hard at work in creating various utilities, including the most recent, very successful digital dashboard and widget wizard. How have we done this? We've used the Eclipse BDT, and they've experienced several time-saving tips that we thought we'd share with you today. Easy navigation by line number, bookmarks to easily return to a block of code, outline view to locate labels and more, real-time diff capabilities, revealing the modified code or deleted code, ability to select blocks of text and edit them all at once, coding templates with an ability to define your own, an ability to easily comment out blocks of code and implement automatic line continuations. But don't just take my word for it. Let me hand off to Nick, one of the architects of the digital dashboard, to tell you firsthand about his experiences with the new features in the Eclipse BDT.
Finding your way around a large program requires either a photographic memory or, thankfully for us, an editor like the BDT with built-in capabilities to facilitate locating sections of code. For starters, if you know the exact line number that you're looking for, which may be the case when your program drops to console with an error, you can go to the desired line directly. When working with commonly used routines, you can add a bookmark to one or more lines of code, making it easy to return to that same section later. The bookmark view shows all of your saved bookmarks, and double-clicking on one of them will even open up the file in the editor if necessary, and then scroll to the saved position. The outline view is also indispensable for navigation. Clicking on line labels like init or EOJ immediately causes the editor view to jump to the selected label in the program. Even user-defined functions are available for quick selection, and their unique wrench icon makes them stand out from other program constructs. The outline view is even more useful for object-oriented programs, as it lists all of the classes and interfaces in the file. You can expand a class to view all of its field variables and methods. Clicking on a method, such as one of the bar chart widget's constructors, jumps to that part of the file in the editor, and clicking on the disclosure triangle reveals all of the method's parameters along with their types. Lastly, if you're interested in sections of the code that have changed compared to a version in your source code repository, you can use the real-time diff capability to highlight sections of the code in the left and right gutters. The right gutter gives us an overview of the entire program, and the left gutter deals with individual lines of code. Clicking on a blue section in the right takes us to portions of the code that were modified, and hovering over the left gutter's blue section reveals the previous code. Likewise, clicking on the right gutter's first green block takes us to a newly added section of code, and hovering over the left gutter's red sections show us what the recently deleted lines of code look like. Right-clicking even allows us to restore the deleted code if desired. The BDT offers several time savers that come into play while editing code. One of these time savers involves the block selection mode, which allows us to select rectangular areas of text instead of wrapped lines. Block selection mode can be configured to use a different font, so it's easy to distinguish which editing mode we're in. Toggling between regular line selection mode and block selection mode is now much more obvious than just detecting the I-beam or crosshair's cursor. To demonstrate the block selection mode, we'll copy in a section of an SQL statement from another program. To start, we'll separate each field onto its own line to aid in legibility. Next, we have to integrate it into our program by concatenating the strings into an SQL string variable. Block selection mode makes this easy, as we can modify all 3 lines at once. After selecting the desired columns, any editing that I do automatically applies to all of the selected sections. This makes it simple to add the fields to the SQL statement and wrap all of the strings in quotes. Templates are another way that we can exploit Eclipse's capabilities to save ourselves some repetitive typing. Programs often involve if-then conditionals, and the BDT comes pre-configured with coding templates for those, as well as dozens of other constructs. Best of all, we can ignore the mouse for a bit, as the template takes care of cursor positioning for us. After expanding our if and choosing the if-then template, not only is the text inserted for us, but the condition is already highlighted. That means that we can start typing and our keystrokes will overwrite the condition placeholder. And we didn't even have to reach for the mouse to position the cursor. What happens after we've typed our condition? We just hit return and the remainder of the if-then line will remain intact and our next keystrokes correspond to the first enclosed command. These templates are even better for bigger constructs such as switch statements, as they automatically insert the correct format and include the necessary and, quite honestly, sometimes forgotten, break statements, as well as the default case. As nice as the built-in templates are, it's likely that you can come up with a few of your own that can aid in your particular development style. The BDT lets you define your own templates, such as the log one that I created. After typing in what resolves to a string, I can highlight the text and choose the log template. This modifies my code so that the string I selected will be logged out to the BBJ services debug file, a very useful trick when testing or debugging trigger code. The last 2 time savers seem extremely basic, but it's amazing at how often they come into play during a development cycle. The first involves commenting out blocks of code. After selecting multiple lines in your program, you can comment them out in a single keystroke. Instead of manually adding a rem to each line, the BDT does it all for you. And best of all, removal of the remarks are just as easy, and the BDT retains any custom indentation in the code. The second basic time saver is the way that the BDT automatically inserts line continuations for code that's split in the middle of strings. After pressing the return key at the desired spot, the BDT adds in a new trailing quote and moves the remainder of the line down while adding in the colon continuation character as well as a new beginning quote. Eclipse and the new BDT are incredibly versatile and configurable, offering many ways to improve your coding experience.
Thanks, Nick. Let's talk now about availability and applicability to the version of the interpreter that you're using. Well, with BBJ, you can use the current release, and all of these features and functions we've shown you today are available to you. If you're running Visual Pro 5 and Pro 5, you can either upgrade to BBJ or you can just switch to the BBJ database management system for the trigger functionality we spoke about today. There's no data conversion, and generally it runs faster than if you're using the Pro 5 data server. And if you wish to take advantage of BBJ functionality, you can either X-call it on the server, or you could S-call BBJ in the browser user interface, which would run on most any desktop or mobile device. So in summary, we've given you several good reasons to use the latest BBX for your own development and your deployment. We've shown you some features of the language and interpreter, and again, these are just highlights: the BBjHtmlView, the database management system, asynchronous triggers we've highlighted today, development tools, BBXImage, and tips and tricks on the Eclipse BDT plugins. In our next Java break, we'll review more good reasons to use the latest BBX. For more detail about all the features and functions in the latest product, go to our website www.basis.com and have a look at the announcement notifications. Let's take your questions.